Here's an old 1940s Westinghouse 2YC air compressor. I had picked this up a couple years ago now to replace the Quincy 325 that was sitting up here because it kept having issues with the valves jumping around in the head, and those valves in the Quincy had used a bolt that went through the head, and it would actually rattle the bolt loose, and then the bolt would strip out the valve itself, and that became an expensive fix. So I was on Craigslist one day and I came across a guy selling this a couple towns over for, I think it was like $90, and it came with an old electric motor and a tank. But I explained to him I didn't have a vehicle to take the tank, but I would pull the pump off and take the electric motor. I ended up scrapping the motor. I think that was an old Century 3 horsepower repulsion start. I didn't think anything of it. I didn't have the room to keep the other motors sitting around. So I had this Marathon 5 horsepower that came with the Quincy 325 that I figured I would use. The only things that I did to this was I sped the pump up. So from my calculations, taking the sheave size that I had for the Quincy and the flywheel diameter back there on this, it came out to like 800 something RPMs, which is within the range that this pump can run. It's making, I think, about 13 to 14 CFM, because the Quincy was making around 18, and it'll pump this 80-gallon tank up that I have to 150 and think about 6.5 minutes. The Quincy took, I think, 4 minutes and 50 seconds, or maybe it was 5 minutes and 25 seconds to build up 150 psi. I don't ever have it go any higher, just for the simple fact that the tank's never been pressure tested and it's old, so 150 works fine. I just have it at home in my little garage here. Yeah, I would have to say this pump is better than a Quincy. I know people are going to disagree, but I beg to differ. I've had nothing but problems with the Quincy and the valves. This thing never had any maintenance done on it. I repainted the pump when I got it. It's a 3 to 5 horsepower. The only downside to this pump is the intercooler on it, which you can see back there. It just has 2 very short crossover bars that are finned, unlike the Quincy where it loops down under the crankshaft and then back up, so you have more surface area to cool the air down. So that's the only downside to this pump. If you know anything about Westinghouse, you would see the 3YC. This is a 2YC pump, by the way. It goes in a circle around the back of that flywheel, so it gets more air being blown over it to cool the air down. So what I had to do to make this work on here is rig up from here over to here and then down with some black piping from Home Depot. And originally when I started taking this off, something happened and it started getting stripped there, so I had to buy a big tap and die and re-tap this hole the best I could and thread this in there so it doesn't leak air from there, but I'd be afraid to pull that back out. Overall, it's a really good air compressor. It's pressure lubricated, so it does have an oil pump down inside of there. It doesn't read out oil pressure like the Quincy does, but it runs relatively quiet. The only things I've done to it is change out the oil, and I pulled these caps off. You got one on the high pressure side, or 2 on the high pressure and 2 on the low pressure side. And when you pull these off, there's actually another cap that's similar to this in style, that's smaller, that wedges that valve down into the head. And the valves remind me of like a little Kellogg valve, or almost like a Sailor Beal valve. They're much smaller than the Quincy, and it's got a little spring in there with a little disc that'll go up and down, so as the air's pumping through, it's compressing that spring, letting it go, and then when you turn the pump off, the back pressure pushes that up and keeps it shut inside the valve. But for 90 bucks, I've had it going for 3 years now without any hiccups, so I really can't complain. So it's a good pump. And then I got the Quincy 325 sitting down here. I've been working with a place a couple towns over for buying used parts for it. And last time they had sold me a couple valves they had off one where the bottom end went, but it ended up chewing up that valve. And as you can see on the Quincy, here's the old style of valve caps, where underneath this there's a set screw that you torque down to 90 foot-pounds, but that would keep backing out and allowing the valve to bounce around. The new style uses a nut or a bolt and jam nut that you crank down to hold the valve down on the head. So that's been sitting there for a couple years. There was a guy selling one on Craigslist not that long ago that I was interested in buying, but somebody beat me to the punch. Actually, the guy wanted like $100 for it. It was 3-phase. I told him I just wanted the compressor pump, but what can you do? So I'll fire this one up and let it run for a minute. So just let it ran for a minute. That was 30 psi. It is noisier than the Quincy, but it's not super obnoxious. I've had a couple different air compressors that I've restored over the years and sold, and they were much louder. Overall, if you can find one of these, they're definitely worth buying. I believe they actually used to run the next model up, the 3YC, back in the early 40s down in New York City on locomotives. They would use them for the air brakes from everything that I've read online. And they do have some bigger ones, a 4YC, and I believe there's even a 5YC, but you would really need 3-phase electricity, and that's just a huge air compressor. I mean, this thing's a bear to move. It's got to be 190 pounds with the flywheel on there, so it's a good sized air compressor, and it makes plenty of air for a home shop. But that's all. Take care now.